Hey everyone, I never thought I'd be writing a post like this, but I just went through something crazy, and I need to share it. For context, I'm the CEO of a mid-sized logistics company. We handle shipping and supply chain management for various industries, and I built this business from the ground up. I started in a tiny office with just 5 employees, and now we've got over 500 people working across multiple locations. But here's the thing, lately things have felt off. Customer complaints have been creeping up, shipping delays are becoming more frequent, and turnover in our warehouses is at an all-time high. My exec team kept assuring me everything was under control, but the numbers weren't adding up. So I did what any paranoid CEO would do. I decided to go undercover. I became Matt, a new temp worker at one of our busiest distribution centers. I grew out some stubble, ditched my usual business casual look, and showed up for my first shift in steel-toed boots and a cheap hoodie. No one knew who I was. The first thing that hit me? The sheer exhaustion on everyone's faces. I was expecting some level of hustle, it's a warehouse after all, but the atmosphere was different. People looked drained, not just physically but mentally. My trainer was a guy named Luis, who had been there for 3 years. He gave me a tired smile and said, "Welcome to the grind." I laughed, thinking it was just a joke. It wasn't. Within my first hour, I saw things that made my stomach turn. The software we use for tracking shipments was glitchy, causing people to manually log data on paper. Equipment that should have been replaced months ago was still in use, forcing workers to come up with creative and unsafe solutions. And then there was the supervisor, Brad. Brad was the kind of guy who loved being in charge a little too much. He yelled more than he talked, barked orders without looking up from his phone, and seemed to take pleasure in making people nervous. "You move too slow, you're out." "No excuses," he announced during my first break, not even looking at the workers he was addressing. I was stunned. This wasn't the company I built. Then, something happened that really shook me. A forklift operator named Jake, who had been working a double shift, miscalculated a turn and knocked over a pallet of goods. It wasn't a massive accident, no one got hurt, but Brad lost it. "Are you kidding me, Jake?" "That's coming out of your paycheck," he snapped. Jake, clearly exhausted, mumbled an apology and started cleaning up the mess. I could see the defeat in his posture. That's when I stepped in. "You sure that's legal?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. Brad turned to me with a smirk. "You got a problem, new guy?" I shrugged. "Just seems like an accident. Didn't know we had to pay for those out of pocket." Brad stared at me for a second before laughing. "You wouldn't last a week here," he muttered before walking off. I clenched my fists, feeling anger bubble up inside me. Not just at Brad, but at myself. How had I let this happen under my watch? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? So, after watching Brad humiliate Jake over a simple accident, I knew I had to dig deeper. I spent the rest of my shift paying attention, not just to the work but to the people. And what I saw. It made my blood boil. Breaks were basically non-existent. Legally, workers were supposed to get a 15-minute break every 4 hours and a 30-minute meal break during long shifts. But in reality, people were scared to take them. "We don't stop moving here," Luis told me when I asked. "You take too long on break, you come back to find out you've been replaced." I thought he was joking, until I saw it happen. A woman named Rosa, who had been working for the company for over a year, took an extra 5 minutes on her lunch break. Maybe she needed the time, maybe she lost track, but when she came back, Brad was waiting for her. "You can go home," he said. "Don't bother coming back." "Wait, what?" she stammered. I was just..." "No excuses," Brad cut her off. "Clock out." And that was it. No warning, no discussion, no consideration for the fact that she was one of the hardest workers there. I watched Rosa blink back tears as she grabbed her things and walked out. And that's when I realized, Brad wasn't the problem. He was a symptom. The real issue was bigger than him. Somewhere along the way, the culture in my warehouse had turned toxic. People weren't treated like employees. They were treated like disposable parts in a machine. I needed to see just how deep it went. During the second half of my shift, I found myself working next to Jake, the forklift operator Brad had humiliated earlier. "You good?" I asked him quietly. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I dunno, man. Feels like no matter how hard we work, it's never enough. How long have you been here? Almost 5 years. He let out a dry laugh. Started when this place was actually decent. We had good managers back then. Fair ones. But they got pushed out, and now, he gestured around the warehouse. Now it's just survive or get replaced. I took a slow breath, letting his words sink in. 5 years. He had been here longer than most, had seen the good and bad, and this was where he landed? Just trying to survive? Then he dropped the bombshell. Honestly, man, if I had another option, I'd be gone. But I got a kid. Bills. This job isn't great, but it's better than nothing. That hit me harder than I expected. Because Jake wasn't lazy. He wasn't unmotivated. He was stuck. And that's when I knew, this wasn't just a management problem. It was a leadership failure. My failure. I built this company to provide good jobs. Jobs that gave people stability, respect, and opportunity. But somewhere along the way, that promise had been broken. And as much as I wanted to blame Brad, I couldn't. This was on me. I left that shift with one goal in mind: fix this. But I wasn't going to do it from a boardroom. I wasn't going to rely on polished reports and second-hand information. I needed to see more. So I made a decision, one that might have been a little crazy. I was going to work here for 1 more week. No CEO privileges. No special treatment. Just me in the trenches, seeing exactly what needed to change. And by the end of that week, Brad was going to have the shock of his life. By the time I clocked in for my second shift, I had a plan. It wasn't enough to just see what was wrong. I needed to feel it, to experience what my employees went through every single day. If I was going to fix this, I had to understand it from the ground level. So I kept my head down, worked like any other temp, and watched. I paid attention to the exhaustion in my coworkers' faces, the way they flinched when Brad walked by, how they moved quickly but carefully, afraid of making even the smallest mistake. The real weight of it hit me when I met Angela. She was in her late 50s, clearly one of the older employees, but she worked just as hard as everyone else, if not harder. I was stacking pallets when she stopped beside me, rolling her shoulder with a wince. "Long day?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She huffed a tired laugh. "Every day's a long day, kid." "How long you been here?" "Almost 10 years. She smiled, but there was a sadness behind it. Back when we had enough staff to actually do the work without breaking our backs. That sat heavy in my chest. 10 years. That was dedication. That was loyalty. And yet, she looked like someone just barely hanging on. "You ever think about leaving?" I asked. She shrugged. "Where would I go? I'm too old to start over, and I got grandkids to take care of." I didn't know what to say. There was something so fundamentally broken about the fact that someone like Angela, who had given this company 10 years of her life, felt trapped. And yet, when Brad walked by, he didn't even acknowledge her. Just kept his eyes on his clipboard, shouting orders like always. That was when I realized something even worse. Brad wasn't just toxic, he was comfortable. He had built his little kingdom here, where he was the boss and no one could question him. He thought he could treat people however he wanted because no one was watching. But I was. By my third shift, I noticed something else. Connor, the quiet guy from the packing section, was doing 2 people's jobs. I watched him move like clockwork, sealing boxes, labeling, and sorting without slowing down. But every few minutes, he'd glance up, looking across the warehouse like he was waiting for something. Or someone. Finally, I caught on. Brad had a pattern. He'd start the day in the break room, barking at people to hurry up. Then he'd make a few rounds through the floor, criticizing people at random, just enough to keep everyone on edge. And then, he'd disappear. Not to do work. Not to check inventory. He'd literally walk out the back door and be gone for an hour, sometimes more. I asked Connor about it later. "Yeah," he said quietly, keeping his voice low. "Dude leaves all the time. Probably goes to get coffee or something. And no one says anything." Connor snorted. "Who's gonna say something? He's been here for years. Management trusts him. If anyone complains, he just makes their life harder." I nodded slowly, biting back my frustration. I had seen enough. By the time my week was up, I had a notebook full of problems. Understaffing, burnout, fear-based leadership, a supervisor who was coasting while making everyone else's job miserable. I could have walked into that warehouse on my last day and dropped the act right then and there. I could have fired Brad on the spot, called a meeting, and told everyone exactly what was about to change. But I had a better idea. I clocked in one last time, did my shift like normal, and when Brad disappeared halfway through the day, I took a walk. Out the back door. Across the parking lot. Into my car. And straight to my corporate office. It was time to remind everyone exactly who I was. When I walked into the executive meeting that afternoon, still in my dusty work boots and warehouse hoodie, my team looked at me like I had lost my mind. "Sir, are you?" my CO started, glancing at my clothes. "I've been working in one of our distribution centers for a week," I cut in. "And what I found. It's unacceptable." Silence. Then I pulled out my notes, dropped them onto the table, and looked my team dead in the eye. "We have a serious problem," I said, "and we're going to fix it. Starting now." The silence in the boardroom was deafening. My exec team just stared at me, eyes flicking between my dusty work boots and the pile of notes I had just slammed onto the table. I could see the disbelief written all over their faces, like they couldn't decide if I had finally lost it or if this was some kind of test. Finally, my CO Mark cleared his throat. "Wait, you've been working in one of the warehouses?" "For a week," I confirmed, arms crossed. "And I've seen enough to know we have a real problem." I could see them scrambling, trying to figure out how to respond. This wasn't just some abstract report or a string of numbers on a spreadsheet. This was me, their CEO, standing in front of them, telling them our company was broken. Mark leaned forward, eyeing the stack of notes. "What exactly did you see?" I didn't hold back. I told them about the exhaustion, the impossible workloads, the culture of fear Brad had created. I told them about how Angela had given 10 years to this company and was still struggling, how Connor was doing two people's jobs just to keep things from falling apart. And then I told them the worst part, how Brad wasn't even doing his job. I watched their faces shift from mild concern to full-blown shock as I explained how he disappeared for hours during his shift, leaving his team to fend for themselves. "And the kicker," I added, letting the frustration creep into my voice. "Everyone knows. They just don't say anything because they're afraid of him. Afraid of retaliation. Afraid of losing their jobs." That last sentence landed hard. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Mark let out a long breath and rubbed his temples. "Jesus." "Yeah," I said. "That's what I thought too." Another exec, Lisa, shook her head. "I mean, we knew turnover was high, but we assumed it was just because warehouse work is tough. We had no idea it was this bad." I almost laughed. "You didn't know because we weren't listening. Because we were sitting here in this nice office, looking at reports instead of talking to the people actually doing the work." I saw a few guilty looks around the table. Good. They should feel guilty. I sure as hell did. Mark exhaled. "All right. What do you want to do?" I didn't hesitate. "First, we're going in tomorrow. All of us." That got their attention. I watched as their eyes widened, glancing at each other like I had just suggested we go dig ditches in the pouring rain. "I want every single person at this table to walk that warehouse floor. Talk to the employees. See what they deal with firsthand." I let that sink in before adding, "And while we're there, I'll be firing Brad. In front of everyone." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Publicly?" "You're damn right, publicly." My voice was steady. "Because they need to see that things are changing. That this kind of leadership is done." Mark nodded slowly. "And after that?" I leaned forward. "We fix this. Better staffing. Better training. A management overhaul. And we make sure no one in this company ever feels trapped in their job again." I could see the weight of it hitting them, the realization that this wasn't just about firing one bad manager, it was about rebuilding the company from the inside out. I pushed back from the table and grabbed my notes. "Get some rest," I told them. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." And with that, I walked out. Because tomorrow, Brad was going to learn exactly who he had been messing with. The next morning, I walked into the warehouse with my entire executive team behind me. It was an unusual sight. Normally, these people sat in glass-walled offices, poring over spreadsheets and financial projections. Today they were in jeans, steel-toed boots, and company vests, walking straight into the reality they had been blind to for far too long. The air was thick with tension. Employees stopped what they were doing to watch us. Some whispered. Others just stared. And then there was Brad. He was in the middle of lecturing Connor when he spotted me. His smirk faded. He looked me up and down, like he was trying to place my face. Then, his expression shifted into something I'd seen too many times before: cocky confidence. "Didn't expect to see you back, new guy," Brad said, folding his arms. "Figured you wouldn't last the week." I took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch between us before finally responding. "Oh, I lasted," I said evenly. "And now? We need to talk." Brad snorted. "Yeah? About what?" I reached into my pocket, pulled out my company ID, and flipped it open. The shift in the room was instant. Employees gasped. Connor's jaw dropped. Angela literally dropped the box she was holding. And Brad? Brad went pale. For the first time since I met him, he didn't have anything to say. I let the moment linger before finally breaking the silence. "My name is Matt Reynolds. I own this company. And I've been working under you for the past week." If the employees weren't staring before, they sure as hell were now. I could see Brad's brain trying to catch up. Trying to salvage this. Trying to find some way out. I didn't know," he finally stammered. I smiled. "I know you didn't. That's what makes this so interesting." I took a step closer, lowering my voice just enough for everyone to hear but keeping it steady. "You see, Brad, I started this company to provide good jobs for good people. But what I saw this week..." I shook my head. "That's not what we built. And you? You're a big part of why." His face flushed red. "Look, if I said anything that..." "No," I interrupted. "No excuses. I saw everything. The way you treat people. The way you abuse your position. The way you walk out in the middle of your shifts while everyone else picks up your slack." Brad swallowed. I do my job." "No," I said flatly. "You don't. And you won't be doing it anymore." Silence. Then I turned to Mark, my CO. "Make it official." Mark nodded. "Brad, you're terminated effective immediately. HR will follow up about severance, but as of now, you're done." Brad's mouth opened and closed. He looked around, desperate for support, but the room had turned against him. Employees who had been terrified of him just yesterday now stood tall, watching him with quiet satisfaction. And that's when it hit him. His power was gone. For the first time since I'd met him, Brad had nothing left to say. He grabbed his things, shoved past my executives, and walked out. As the door swung shut behind him, the warehouse stayed silent for another few beats, until Connor let out a breath and muttered, "Holy SH." Laughter rippled through the team, a mixture of disbelief and relief. And then I did something that no CEO had done in this building for a long time. I listened. I spent the rest of the day talking to employees, not from behind a desk, not through an email, but right there on the floor. I asked them what they needed, what was broken, what we could do better. And they told me. We didn't just fire Brad that day. We rebuilt trust. And when I walked out of that warehouse at the end of my shift, I knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. For the first time in a long time, the warehouse felt different. People still worked hard, but there was something else in the air: relief. Like a weight had been lifted. Like maybe, just maybe, things were about to change for the better. But firing Brad was the easy part. Fixing the deeper issues? That was going to take real work. After he left, I called an all-hands meeting right there on the warehouse floor. Some of my executives looked uncomfortable, probably because they weren't used to standing in front of employees without a desk between them. But this wasn't the time for boardrooms. This wasn't about formality. I stood up on a pallet stack so everyone could see me. The room quieted fast. "I need to say something," I began, my voice steady. "I built this company from the ground up. And when I started, I swore that it would be a place where people could build real careers. A place where hard work was valued. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I let people like Brad ruin what we built. That's on me. Silence. People weren't used to hearing a CEO admit fault. But starting today, I continued, scanning the crowd, that changes. And I don't just mean replacing Brad. I mean real, actual changes to make this a place you want to work. That starts with one thing: hearing you. I glanced at Angela, at Connor, at every exhausted face in that warehouse. So talk to me. Right now. What needs to change? It started slow. A few people shifted uncomfortably, unsure if this was a real opportunity or just a corporate stunt. But then Luis, the guy who trained me, spoke up. We need more people, he said. We're always short-staffed, and when we're behind, management just tells us to pick up the slack instead of hiring help. I nodded. Got it. We'll start hiring immediately. Then Angela crossed her arms and said, "You know we don't even get proper breaks half the time, right?" I clenched my jaw. That ends now. Breaks will be enforced. No more skipping just because we're busy. And then it snowballed. Connor, the equipment is old. Things keep breaking, and we just have to deal with it. Megan, half the time, we don't even know what's going on with the company. We hear about changes after they happen. Jake, overtime rules are a mess. We either get guilt-tripped into staying late or punished for leaving on time. One by one, people spoke up. And I wrote down every single thing they said. When they finished, I took a deep breath and said, "All right. Here's what we're going to do. First, new hires. No more running on skeleton crews. We were going to staff every warehouse properly, so no one had to work themselves to the brink. Second, updated equipment. I turned to Lisa, our head of operations, and said, I want a full audit of every broken, outdated, or failing piece of equipment. We replace what needs replacing. No more just deal with it. Third, transparency. No more radio silence from leadership. Regular updates, open-door policies, and monthly town halls where employees could ask anything. Fourth, management training. No more power-tripping supervisors. We were rolling out a leadership development program, and anyone who wanted to move up had to go through it. No exceptions. Fifth, wages and overtime. I promised them we'd do a full pay review, because if people were struggling after years at this company, we were doing something wrong. I saw people soften. For the first time, they looked at me not like I was some out-of-touch executive, but like someone who actually cared. 2 months later, I walked back into the warehouse, not as Matt the temp, but as the CEO. And this time, it felt different. The tension was gone. The exhaustion? Still there. It was hard work after all, but people weren't defeated anymore. They were engaged. Talking. Smiling. Connor was now a team lead. Angela had finally trained a new hire to help with her workload. And Luis? He pulled me aside and said, I don't know what kind of magic you pulled, but this is the best this place has felt in years. It wasn't magic. It was listening. We hired 40 new employees across locations, fixed all the broken equipment, and gave raises where they were long overdue. The management training? Already paying off. New supervisors were mentors, not dictators. And Brad? Well, last I heard, he was not missed. The best part? People stayed. Turnover plummeted. Productivity rose. And for the first time in years, employees believed in this company again. Before I left, Angela stopped me. You know, when you first showed up, I thought you were just another guy who wouldn't last. I grinned. You weren't wrong. But I had to see it for myself. She nodded. Well, you saw it. And you actually did something. That stuck with me. Because at the end of the day, leadership isn't about titles. It's about showing up, listening, and making things better. And that's exactly what we did.